Welcome to the Small Biz Life, episode 55. So we keep hearing that storytelling is important for business, but how do we do it?
That's a really long title.
I like long titles. I got much higher grades on my papers in school when I had long titles.
Okay.
Does this sound familiar?
Oh my God, I have so much to do today.
Don't forget to breathe.
But I have almost 400 emails in my inbox and 30 phone calls to make.
Have you looked into getting a virtual assistant yet?
Oh, and I need to schedule all my social media posts.
Did you drink anything today?
I had coffee.
Did you eat today?
Did I mention coffee's a bean?
This is Small Biz Life.
Hey guys, welcome to Small Biz Life. My name's Kristen Ingram.
And I'm Jeffrey W. Ingram.
And if you're a returning listener, thank you so much for being with us again this week. And if you're new to the show, welcome. We're so glad that you're here. I am a CPA.
And I am a crazy man. Oh, who happens to be an information technology analyst and a fantasy storyteller.
Yes, which is really interesting because this episode is right in Jeff's wheelhouse. And we're a small business owner, husband and wife team that are walking with you on this journey through what we call the small biz life, because we know that this is not a 9-to-5 adventure.
Yeah. And this is a particularly poignant one to me because not only do I like telling stories that are fictional, a lot of times my job as an information technology analyst is to figure out how do I make data stories? How do I turn zeros and ones into stories that make them more effective? So I'm very excited about this.
Yeah. And, I was talking to a business owner earlier this week, and, we were talking about the fact that we both really hate to sell. And I think that storytelling is a really good way to sell without selling.
Yeah. And not only that, though, it's like some of the things that you look for in advertising, really, when you think about it, what is it? It's something memorable. Well, the wonderful thing if you tell stories when you market to people is we're hardwired to remember stories. That's the reason why when early people were trying to figure out how to explain the universe to each other, they came up with mythology as a way to explain how the world works and how we should act in it to fit in. And really, that's, I think, becoming more common knowledge among business owners is that power of storytelling to help people remember. And if it's a good story, it's memorable, it's entertaining, and hopefully it keeps them in the call to action. And that's really what a good ad is.
Well, and it's funny because I was talking to a student last night, a former student of mine who I ran into at a recruiting event. One of the things that he remembers most from his entire education is a story that I told on the first day of the first class he had with me. And it was a story that was designed to help students understand like why you can't have note cards with you all the time. Instead of saying, no, you can't have note cards, for your exams, I tell this story and it has a huge impact on students. And so think about some of your favorite commercials of all time, some of the people that you really enjoy following, and think about the stories that they tell.
Yeah.
Right? I know like Brendan Burchard is huge. He's got a great story. Dave Ramsey has a great story. Michael Hyatt has a great story.
John Acuff has, his books are a story with points at the end.
Right. Exactly. The thing about it's like the Bible is all life lessons, but instead of saying do this, do that, do this, do that, it's their stories to convey that message.
Or in a way, there are parts of the Bible that say do this, do that, do this. But the parts that people typically go to are, it's the story of the life of Jesus or the story of Noah, Genesis, Exodus,
Job.
But, those are the stories that people remember and talk about. Those stick with you first. And then, if the point of the story is to teach you a life lesson, hopefully you pick those up along. But you do it at a subconscious level when you remember the story.
Right, exactly. So you have all these experts that tell you that you have to tell your story, to grow your business, and you have to incorporate your story in. And I think that the people who watch the webinar series, especially if they were in the one on fear, they got our story. And I think that was really impactful, but it helped relate us to that audience.
And that is probably the most common story you see with businesses now, is the backstory of the business. If it's a individual as a brand, it's the backstory of the people. And that's the easiest one to get to, the easiest story to get to, because we see so many great examples of it. But what we don't often see are all the stories that we are told that come through like good advertising, that really you don't think of as a story because it doesn't have a plot that you're used to seeing, not characters in a story that you're used to seeing, but they're really stories told in a different way. And I think one of the things I want to get to in this is how to take the elements of a story and how can you get to other types of ads with that? Or possibly it doesn't have to even be for ads. If one of the things you do as a service is teach people, like you're a business coach, you teach people anything, stories relate the importance of the material. Sometimes even if you own a shop, stories of how, and I just go this because I know we have a knitter who listens constantly to us, but it's like,
shout out to Lee Ann. But how does storytelling help a business owner like her who's teaching people how to knit? Well, what are great stories about how knitting either brought friends together? What are great stories about how people alleviate stress through knitting? There are an infinite number of stories that can be told. And I think if we understand a little bit about what a story is, and they always talk about the 5 elements of story. I criticize that and say there's actually 5 plus 1. And the plus 1 will not shock anyone who listens to this show. So I want to start. What do you do when you don't think you have a compelling story? Or you don't want to tell your story because for whatever reason, it's very personal.
It's outside of your comfort zone.
Right. It's outside your comfort zone. So for example, Dave Ramsey talks about his bankruptcy and digging himself out of that. Our story, we talk about starting your business, and then, it was slow to grow, and then it finally started growing.
But it was too late.
Because then I got sick, and, me starting my business while I was going through chemo. Some people have big stories, and some people don't believe that their story is worthy enough to tell. So what do you do in that case?
I would argue you overcome that fear, because anyone who knows me understands I'm not big in sharing personal feelings. My wife can probably attest to that as much as anyone in the world.
But you got teary on the webinar on fear.
Yes. Because, I told a story I don't like to tell. And
but what compelled you to tell that story? Because I know that you are a much more personal person than I am.
It just got to a point where I think it was one very relevant to the discussion, and because I know the power of storytelling. So for me, that kind of helps me overcome my fear and embarrassment of being a guy who gets upset about something, who has fear. Men exude confidence, and most people who know me, and don't think I'm an arrogant jerk, think I'm confident. So, it doesn't even really make me question my own confidence. It's just, to me, it's one of those things that, it shows me weak, but I came over it because I think the benefit that it provided outweighed the personal nature of it.
Well, and I think too, especially for guys, and this sometimes doesn't work for women, but when you show vulnerability as a guy, I think that helps with showing your confidence because you're confident enough to be vulnerable in front of your audience?
Maybe, but that doesn't get you past the psychological mess to get there. But I think one of the things people have to get past in this idea of storytelling for business is it doesn't have to be your personal story. It might not even be about you. Now, obviously, if you're your own brand, like Chris and I are the Small Biz Life brand, our story is the brand story. The reason bootstrapping is so important to us is understood more when you understand the story of me starting my business and Kristen starting chemo. That helps explain why we're very big into bootstrapping, even when you don't need to bootstrap, why you should. But the thing is, it's if you understand the elements of stories, you can construct a story around a product or a service that you have, because that becomes a character. So that's really where it gets back to understanding what a story really is. You can, stories are formulas. They're, typically 3-act plays, but they don't have to be. They can be shorter than that. That follows either a plot or a character-driven structure, which that's more advanced. Maybe we'll talk about that at a different time. But, essentially it follows the story, but it's what's the story ultimately do? It deals with a conflict. Maybe it's an internal conflict. Maybe it's an external conflict. And what are you trying to do when you're selling a product? Well, you're trying to actually solve a problem for someone, and you're offering your product to help fix that problem.
Right. And I think, you have a really good opportunity to use story in testimonials from customers. So if you don't want to tell your own story, talk to a customer about using their story, because, most testimonials are like, wow, they're a great company to work with. They're very responsive, and that's great. But see if you can say, if you can use their story with that testimonial. Yeah. So, this person was having, trouble with all their computers. It was slowing them down. We were able to go in, cleaned up their computers, and then put in the testimonial, because then you've got a little bit of a story for how you got this person to think that you are a rock star. Yeah.
So before we get too much more into talking about specifically for business, I want to take a step back for a moment and go over what are the elements of a story.
Okay.
And a lot of people will know some of these, and some people might know all of these. But then once we have a definition for those kind of things, we can start applying it better to business, because that's one of the perfect stories I wanted to talk about, because some people do a very good job of customer testimonials as stories, especially when they feed you a story, beg them to use it. But let's take that step back. Now, the first thing, and I'm putting these in a certain order on purpose. There are typically 5 elements, and they're not usually talked about in this way. But I sort of changed the order into a way that I think it's easier to think through when you're developing a story that you're not familiar with. And the first thing is, what's the theme of the story? Ultimately, what's the central point to what you want to do? Is it to sell a certain product or service? Is it to sell or expand your brand awareness? Is it to drive traffic to your outreach? What are you trying to accomplish? That's the theme. And themes are very important, and they're often lost. And you'll see that sometimes when you get an ad and you go through it and you feel like it's targeted at you, but you don't get what they're trying to tell you, is because they're losing track of the theme. The next part is the conflict. And conflict can be looked at in a couple different ways when it comes to business storytelling. First, you're either creating an analogy story, in which case you probably know what the conflict is because there's already a story developed. But when you're trying to develop a story, you might have, what's the problem I'm going to solve here? My product will do this for you. That's the conflict that you need to get the customer to. Maybe it's the effectiveness of your product or service. And that's, I think, a very good example of what Kristen said is, if I can get a customer to tell their story of how it solved their problem. There are a couple computer companies that do a great job around here, and that's maybe why that even came to her mind, where they have a couple great ads that really are talking about how the computer company came in and solved a problem for them. And how powerful is that to, when your avatar customer is telling your avatar possible customer how you helped them solve a probably very similar problem.
So there's one computer company around here in particular that Jeff's right that I was thinking of. Their ads are a customer telling the story of what this company did for them. And I think that they're incredibly effective because they talk about the problems that they were having before, how that problem was solved. And I think that really helps Jeff's point that the story is much stronger when you show that there was a problem beforehand and you were able to solve it.
Yeah. Because, a lot of times, especially for when you offer those kind of services, the people who you're trying to target have a very similar service because you're trying to really push a product that will resolve it through your company's expertise and help implement it for someone. And so a lot of these small businesses have similar problems that people are trying to solve in different ways. So when you can show an example, not only does it give you authority as being able to do it, but it creates that story that's memorable in that business owner's mind who heard that ad and goes, you know what, I have that same problem. That's X computer company.
Right. And so I think you need to consider that if you're getting testimonials from customers, you don't want the, wow, they're so awesome testimonial. That's not.
Or those are the ones you leave on the website.
Right.
Yeah.
But, the ones that are going to be effective are the ones that introduce some conflict in how you solved it.
And if you ever have a relationship with a customer, have a discussion after a while, and try and pull the story out of them too, because the story might be there. And if they end up with a good story, ask them if you can use it. And especially in those ads, those were radio ads, and they were very effective because it wasn't the company even reading a letter. It was actually in the customer's voice, which to me made that ad very powerful.
Right. Because the customer was willing to put their name and their business's name behind this other company.
Yep. And to take the time out of their day to probably for free record themselves telling the story. And I'm sure the company made it as easy for them as possible to do that. But still, that's a really great strategy to build up stories about products, about services. And any time you can come up with an idea of how your product or brand can help people solve problems, that's a very common conflict. Characters. Characters are important parts of stories. The character could be the owner or brand, or both. It could be a specific product or service or a line of products and services. That all depends on your strategy for selling stuff. It could be a customer or an avatar. You might be talking strictly, trying to pull them in to put it into their shoes, even though you don't have a customer telling you that story. You still are going to try and do that a lot of times when you have a product or services, get into the shoes of the avatar to talk directly to the problems that they're having in their voice and trying to get to that resolution being your product.
Well, and I think that's why it's very effective when you're doing marketing to ask questions of your avatar and say, have you ever experienced this?
Yeah.
Have you ever done this? And what that does is that centers the story around the avatar and makes them a character in the story.
Yep.
That's why I think that is so effective when you're doing marketing, because you're creating the story around them.
Mm-hmm. And then the next thing that you need to consider is the plot. Most ads are plot-driven stories. Actually, most stories you interact with are probably plot-driven. That's where the events are pushing to the next action, which pushes to the conflict resolution, which is the climax of the story. And then there's a resolution that follows. And so you kind of need to know what that path is. And if you're doing online marketing, every part might not be an entire story. It would be very hard to tell an entire story in a Facebook ad. You're allowed an image and a tiny bit of text. The image has to play into the story, but the image and the few words have to play together to get them through to the actual ad, which is where your story's at. But it helps. It's like the intro to the story. It's the prologue. It gets them to the actual advertisement.
Right. Well, I think, like I've told the story before that, it was April 14th during my first tax season and I was rushing to get everything finished and my computer crashed. Mm-hmm. And I started to freak out because what am I going to do? How am I going to get all this work done? My files are gone. And then I remembered that they weren't gone because I had carbonite.
Yes.
And so you can kind of see like, okay, so there's building up, right? There's angst. Like, what am I going to do?
Yes.
And then there's the resolution. Wait, I had carbonite.
That's right. And carbonite saved the day.
Right. So,
our affiliate link will be in the show notes.
and our affiliate link will be in the show notes. But that's a really quick story, right? And you can kind of say, oh, what would I do? You're picture yourself sitting there going, what would I do if my computer crashed? Oh my goodness, I can't even imagine.
Yeah.
Oh wait, but there's a solution for that. And so that was a really short story that can be very compelling.
Yes.
So, these stories, you're not writing a novel.
No.
You can tell stories very quickly, and you see brands do it all the time in commercials.
You can tell a story in 4 sentences.
Right.
And the good thing is when you story tell through marketing, they all don't have to be words. The next thing to think about too, and this is the last official element of stories, is setting. And this is probably the toughest one for most people to contextualize. But like in the example Kristen just told us, the setting was she's at home or at office or somewhere she's at. That's the setting. So it's where the action will take place. Where does it start from? And the reason it's important, and people forget about this in advertising a lot for storytelling, is even if it becomes very abstract where this place is, maybe it's a bad state of mind you're in, that could be a setting for an advertisement. Wherever the setting takes place, you have to realize that because that's where you're trying to pull the people who are advertising to. You need to create some realism around that so that they can, get pulled up into her brain in this advertising, or have their brain transpose with her so they're in the seat with her going, wow, what happens if I lost all my books at once? That would suck. What happens if I lost all of my accounting records? Good gosh, I have to do that again?
Right. So I think that's setting is important because you're trying to get your ideal customer to put themselves in that story and think, what would it be like if that happened to them? You're trying to get them to relate to the story that you're telling. Right.
Yes.
So if you can get the setting in there, that will help them grasp onto the story more quickly. It's like, think about like movies that you've watched where you felt totally immersed in that story, or books that you've read and you were totally immersed, right? This is what you're trying to do very quickly.
Yes. And now for the +1. It's not a date. The +1 to the elements of story that often gets forgotten is audience. And we talk about it all the time on the show as avatar. And the avatar might not be that your normal brand avatar. If you're talking about a product, an ad might have a different target that is close to your normal avatar maybe, but not necessarily your normal avatar. There'd probably be a product advertisement directed directly at your avatar. But you might be doing things around, or maybe you're trying to expand into a new area, so you're targeting a different avatar for a new product because you figure out another way it could be useful. Whenever you can find who your avatar is, you really need to keep that in mind. It's your audience for your ad. So what's going to make the business owner relate to your problems?
Right. And the Institute for Managerial Accountants is a group for accountants that work inside companies. So these aren't public accountants. They work, they're inside corporations.
If you worked in a corporation, these are the people you called bean counters.
Right, exactly. These are the bean counters. So they are doing some very targeted marketing to try to get millennials to get the CMA designation, which is kind of like the CPA, but for internal accountants. And they created this commercial, and I'll link it into the show notes, where there's like these three, kind of geeky looking millennials, and one of them is getting like this tattoo, like I am a, certified managerial accountant on their back. And, their thing is that this is such a major accomplishment. Like this is a hard thing to do, but when you do it, it's like, it's gigantic. And, and like for me, like I was looking at the commercial and I'm like, yeah, that's kind of silly. But millennials that I've shown it to were like, okay, that's really amusing. Yeah. I get it. And so not all of your advertising might appeal to everyone. And sometimes, we talked about niching and niching down, it down. And I think that there are times when you deal with a smaller segment of your avatar and you pinpoint a story just to them. So sometimes in the show, we'll talk about authors, right? And that's because, Jeff interacts with a lot of authors because he's a fantasy writer and storyteller. And so, every once in a while, we'll kind of pull them in, right? And talk directly to them. And that's okay.
Yeah.
You can do that. So, if you're in IT, you might do some very targeted advertising to like accountants.
Yes.
Right? Because they have very particular IT needs versus trying to do a blanket ad for all small businesses.
One thing about it too, especially in IT, it's, the needs of a business, and like real estate agents are going to have very specific needs that they have. Lawyers, they need pencil sharpeners because they're not really much into the IT age. I take that back. Please don't sue me. Accountants, there's very specific needs from these businesses to businesses. And the more experience you have in working with those kind of things, the better you can actually even address those answers. And maybe you're not reaching the size of the audience you are, but you're actually speaking more intelligently to your target because you're answering their specific needs. And that's where it sort of comes back to me. I think the most important thing is understanding your conflict in the story, because it's not always problem solving in advertising. Sometimes you're trying to maybe associate your brand with bringing education to people or peace to people. So that would be the conflict for the story, is this person transcendent, maybe in that place already, and remembering how they got there. There are lots of ways to tell stories once you understand what the conflict is, but develop the flow of the story, and don't worry about it sounding like, and Jim, the accountant, attacks the dragon, even though you do get bonus points for using dragons, obviously. But, the thing is you have to keep in mind is, it doesn't need to be a novel. It shouldn't be a novel, because if you write that much copy, they're not going to read it anyway. Unless the target audience are people who read novels, maybe then that might work. But, the thing to keep in mind is understand really the conflict in your audience are, to me, the two most important things to understand. Plots get muddled, and if you watch TV shows, like every TV show on an evening on a channel, there are going to be some plots that you get lost in. And that can happen. But, if you can really pull out what the conflict is and get to the resolution, because the resolution is the most important part of the story here, because that's your call to action. That's okay, now Jim has slain the dragon of paperwork, and now he is in nirvana for accountants because he's gotten past all of the paperwork that holds accountants back. Now he's picking up the thing that got it started for him, and it was, a small biz life class. Or it was a book that basically started him down this journey to get rid of all of his papers. It's the answer. The resolution in these stories are your call to action. you know, because you are ultimately the answer to that problem. Your product was, your brand was, you are the resolution. And when you get there, you need to understand that. And you really need to pull out of the resolution that he did it by doing this. And some ads are over the top with it, but you know what? Those are probably more effective when you're just like, hey, go to this website and do this, and this, it will bring you to paperless nirvana.
Right. Exactly. So it's funny because you were telling that story and I could kind of see like, this accountant, and he's like triumphant and he holds his scanner up over his head like, ha ha, I have slayed the paper dragon, right? And like that is his sword.
That
right?
is his sword.
Scanner,
That's right. And the great thing is too is understand people naturally want to follow the story. Their brains will fill in the details, and authors oftentimes make a mistake in this. And I think, and even more so, it would be a worse mistake to add is don't fill in all of the details. If there is an antagonist and a protagonist, don't over describe the protagonist. Well, because you want them to be able to step into the shoes. Don't over describe the antagonist, because you want them to fill in their worst villain that's relatable to it. It's the idea of it was a great miniseries, but the book was better because when you read the book, you're not quite sure what this thing would ever look like at any one time. You get the idea it's a clown, but what's a creepy clown to you and to me could be different. Don't try and create a Faulkner novel around this topic. Keep it vague. Let them fill in the details. Their brains will want to do that. Their brains are driven to do that because they're driven to understand and remember stories. And the more that they fill in, as long as the story's there, they can fill in the details that are relevant to themselves and then personalize it. It'll make it more rememberable.
Well, and that's the thing. It's like, like Jeff talked about, like the paper on the desk, and he wasn't specific about it. So maybe for you, it's your mail that piles up, or it's invoices that you get from vendors. Your paper might look different, but just referring to it as paper, we all have that issue.
Yeah. And to some person, it's the two pieces of paper on the corner of the desk, like there is in our studio right now, which neither Kristen and I are even noticing because it's such a small amount. But for someone who's more compulsive about cleaning it up, that might be the overwhelming amount. So if I show them a mound of paper, which is what my desk at work can sometimes look like, that is unrealistic and the story is no longer believable. So that's another reason. And when you use images, sometimes you're forced to do that. And that's kind of the reason why I like the written word better, but visuals do work better in advertising.
So can you just sum up again your 5+1?
Sure.
As we're wrapping up the show today?
So here are the things to keep in mind, and I'll even throw in a bit of homework for you to do if you're still a little sketchy on how the stories work. The first thing you need is a theme, the overall centralized point you're trying to get across, the conflict. What's that thing that you're trying to fix? What's that thing that you're going to climax your story at? The characters. Is it the brand? Is it the product? Is it the customers, the people you're actually talking to in the audience? Who are going to be the characters in your story? The plot. What is the actual sequence of events that gets you to the resolution? The setting. Where does this problem take place? And the +1 is the audience. And now for our homework is, we all have ads that are very memorable to us. Why? We'll go to YouTube. They're probably there because if they're memorable to you, they're probably memorable to multiple people. And those things always end up on YouTube. Go to YouTube, watch that ad or wait for it to come on television again if it's still running, and think about what's the theme? What's the conflict? What are the characters? What's the plot? Because much like writing novels or writing short stories, you get better at doing this. And if you're not doing it, breaking it down is the next best thing to do. So take some commercials that are targeted to you and deconstruct them. And it'll be funny because Kristen and I do this, I think, more now than ever before. We watch ads and we'll sometimes be breaking them down in our heads as we're watching them, not necessarily as a story, but was that as an effective ad? Did I have multiple emotional moments in it? That's very key. You want to shift them to the correct emotion. So when they're to the resolution, if it's peaceful and calm, you're relating it back to your brand. It's peaceful and calming to your customers. So break down your ads.
Excellent. So if you liked this episode today, make sure that you are subscribed to the show. And we would love it if you would tell 2 people this week about the podcast.
Yes. In a story form.
That's right. And tell a story about the podcast and what the podcast does for you, right? Practice this on our brand.
Yes, we would appreciate that.
Beautiful. See, it's a win-win. So thank you so much for joining us again this week, and we will see you next time.
And Not a Dragon. This was Small Biz Life.